a terror lurks beneath us. Deep within the abandoned tunnels, in the ruins of once great cities, something is waiting. Not just the smog, scavengers, or forgotten relics of the past, but something far worse, something alive. They say the past is buried beneath us, but what happens when we never stopped feeding it? To understand the nightmare lurking beneath our feet, we must first understand how the world got here. This is the world shaped by war, industry, and desperation. Over centuries, nations and corporations alike pushed technology beyond control, driven by a simple, fatal flaw: the belief that they could survive their own destruction. The world fractured into 5 major powers, each fighting for what little was left. Each of them believed they could outlast the others. Each believed they could control the chaos, but none of them were prepared for what was brewing beneath the surface. For those left behind, survival became something else entirely. In the depths of abandoned cities, in the forgotten tunnels and collapsed stations, people adapted, or they died. Over generations they changed. The air they breathed was poison. The implants they scavenged were decayed relics of a world that no longer cared about them. And so, they became something new, something the world feared. They were dubbed the smog. The elite called them feral, broken, lost. But the truth is more complicated. The smog are not mindless. Some are scavengers, some are soldiers, some are something else entirely, and among them, whispers of a new purpose began to spread. Those living above the surface, comfortably in their floating sanctuaries, knew not of the horrors brewing below. Before the war, before the collapse, there was Sentinel, the last true power in human history. Sentinel was not just a company, it was an experiment in control, a merger of biotechnology and warfare, creating the ultimate tool, instruments of war that never questioned, never hesitated, never failed. The Sentinel was not alone. Every faction, every nation, had their own experiments. Some in medicine, some in weapons, some in things that could never be classified. But somewhere along the way, something went wrong. Publicly, the project was killed. But what happens to something that was designed to survive? Something that was never meant to die in the first place? This ecological bomb went unchecked, already showing its effects with the presence of the smog. Their very existence a testament to nature warped beyond reason. While the nations abandoned their failed experiment, the smog found it, and they did not fear it. They brought offerings, flesh, metal, technology, all in service of something they fully didn't understand. To them, the abominations were not a threat, they were a prophecy. But the world above was blind. The 5 great nations were locked in their own wars, too consumed with their own struggles for power to notice what was happening beneath their feet. Even Sentinel saw no reason to investigate. That would soon change, however. The first signs were initially dismissed. A minor communication failure from a deep zone outpost. A supply chain disruption in a derelict city, blamed on smog raids of course. A distress signal, weak and garbled, lost in the bureaucratic backlog. But then, an entire mining colony vanished. PAU's extraction teams, sent to reclaim deep mined resources from a buried industrial complex, went dark within minutes of arrival. No distress call, no escape logs, no bodies, just silence. PAU's security forces were sent in. It felt as if the walls were breathing, the machines rusting, while still being operational. The air itself thick with metallic dust, and the ground soft, shifting, unstable. And then it moved. The first confirmed reappearance of the abominations was not a battle, it was a massacre. PAU reacted first, deploying heavy containment teams, believing it to be an isolated incident, an outbreak of an old failed experiment. Their forces never returned. The chess piece moved to the Americas Alliance. Their answer to any problem had always been overwhelming force, and this was no different. They deployed a full tactical division supported by orbital fire control. A show of strength, of course, but orbital bombardment did nothing. The abominations absorbed the impact zones. They disappeared, as if it never occurred in the first place. The ground simply shattered, then regrew. The creatures adapted. And for the first time in generations, the Americas Alliance suffered a total operational failure. Their soldiers, instruments of war, designed for domination, were consumed. And not long after, Sentinel intervened. Unlike the nations, Sentinel did not act out of fear. They simply acted out of curiosity. They first sent in recon squads, small surgical teams, not to fight, but to study. And what they found changed everything. They weren't just surviving, they were learning. The smog hadn't just been worshipping them, they had been guiding them, introducing them to new materials, new bodies, new functions, new life forms to consume. Something was happening beneath the surface for far too long, and the world had just noticed far too late. For a time, the governments and corporations had no name for them. They spoke in sterile designations. Autonomous anomalies, self-replicating growths, unidentified bio-machine constructs. But those who lived closest to the underground knew them by another name. Scavengers, those reckless enough to stray too deep into the old ruins, brought back stories. Stories of tunnels collapsing without warning, of entire cities vanishing into dust. They spoke of something enormous, moving beneath their feet, quaking every step. A colossal thing that shook the earth as it fed. A name spread among them, the sandeaters. At first, the nations dismissed it, an old world superstition, scavenger paranoia. But then the earthquakes began. Deep in the ruins of a forgotten megacity, something massive shifted beneath its streets. An entire city block sank overnight, as if the ground itself had swallowed it. Seismic readings were inconclusive, no tectonic activity, no traditional fault lines. But then came the reports. From AEC operatives tracking smog activity in the undercities, from mech engineers monitoring unexplained energy fluctuations, from PAU watching entire mines collapse without explanation, and finally from Sentinel's own recon teams. The sandeaters were not just spreading, they were digging, tunneling, mining, feeding. And at the center of it all, the source of the Tremors was something bigger than any of them had ever seen. The scavengers called it the Great Devourer, the Hollow Queen. And suddenly, the name that once belonged to whispered stories became something real. For the first time, the factions agreed on something. The name was crude, unsophisticated, but it was fitting. If it walks like a monster, eats like a monster, and kills like a monster, then that's exactly what it is. And so the name stuck. The Sandeaters had been born into legend. But this was no myth. This was the beginning of something much worse. Despite the overwhelming danger, the 5 great nations did not unite against the threat. Instead, they turned on each other. In war, the first enemy is always the one closest to you. The Pan-African Union, whose mineral-rich territories were among the first to be lost, refused to continue supplying weapons and resources to factions who had ignored their warnings. Their president stated, "We will not break our backs to arm those who stood idle while we bled." In response, the Americas Alliance began staging Black Ops raids on PAU-controlled resource hubs, extracting what they needed through force rather than diplomacy. The PAU retaliated by secretly backing independent warlords and paramilitary forces, hoping to cripple AA's war machine from within. The European Federation saw weakness, pushed for the creation of a global cybernetic military initiative, a program that would enforce mass augmentation of soldiers to combat the Sandeaters. But the Middle Eastern Consortium rejected that plan, arguing that enhanced troops were still vulnerable to biological corruption, and that the only real countermeasure was cutting off the Sandeaters' access to energy. MEC, without warning, initiated a global energy blackout in suspected infestation zones, plunging entire cities into darkness, hoping to starve the creatures out. This, however, didn't work. Instead, they displaced millions of civilians, destabilizing already fragile regions. The Asian Economic Coalition watched the chaos and made their move, deploying AI-driven kill squads to begin an autonomous cleansing operation. No human oversight, no ethics, just machines, programmed to eradicate anything that moved. It worked at first, then something changed. The Sandeaters began adapting. The drones started malfunctioning. Surveillance feeds corrupted, firewalls breached from the inside, and then the AI stopped responding entirely. When AEC engineers finally restored access, they found something new. The drones weren't just offline, they had been entirely rewritten. A new directive, one not coded by human hands. Protect the core, defend the mother. For the first time, there was undeniable proof. The Queen was more than just a creature, she was something else, something self-aware. Sentinel expected this. They had seen it before, long before the nations realized what they were dealing with. The difference was Sentinel did not fear it. They saw an opportunity. While the factions fought each other, Sentinel positions itself as the only true authority in the war. They controlled the flow of information, dictated the pace of military advancements, supplied every side, ensuring no one had enough power to win outright. And quietly, they ran their own experiments, of course. Deep within the containment zones, Sentinel operatives were conducting live field tests, implanting cybernetic relays into fallen Sandeaters, attempting to override their neural architecture. It was a simple concept. If the Sandeaters adapt, so can we. At first, the results were promising. Limited control, rudimentary responses, but then something responded back. Not the Sandeaters in the field, something deeper, something listening. Sentinel had spent years studying the Queen as a biological entity, something that could be contained, killed, or dissected. But the reality was worse. The Queen was not a simple life form. She was a command structure, a living, evolving network, and Sentinel had just announced its presence to her. Up until now, the Sandeaters had been a growing crisis, but not a structured army. That changed the moment Sentinel touched the network. Within hours, anomalies started appearing across war zones. Sandeaters that had previously acted on instinct were now coordinated, tactical, deliberate. They began to avoid known kill zones. They stopped taking direct engagements with overwhelming military forces. Instead, they began leading them into traps. At first, the nations believed this was simply natural adaptation. Then came the countermeasures. For every new weapon deployed, the Sandeaters responded with new defenses. For every containment method, they found a way to circumvent it. It was not just adaptation, it was strategy. And then something happened that no one could have predicted. The Sandeaters stopped attacking outright. For the first time since the war began, the creatures weren't simply consuming everything in their path. Instead, they began redirecting military movements, forcing enemy factions into direct conflict with each other. Entire battalions found themselves cut off in dead zones, not because of enemy action, but because the terrain itself had been manipulated around them. It was as if they were being herded. The factions refused to acknowledge what evidence was telling them, but Sentinel had already come to the conclusion no one wanted to face. The Sandeaters had a chain of command, and at the top of it, hidden beneath the surface, was her.